For more on this, let's speak to our correspondent at the UN in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, just that particular video where the SGs is remarking and noting today's milestone in the back of a major donor conference underway in Paris. This, of course, in an effort to alleviate the lack of funding for one of the world's largest humanitarian emergencies. What more can you share about this?
The SG making those remarks just a short time ago, he started the remarks with the following. He said, escalating Middle East tensions are pushing other life and death emergencies into the shadows. Of course, a reference to the situation in Sudan. Quote, the world is forgetting the people of Sudan. And I think that just tells you we've been so overwhelmed by developments in the Middle East, no less the situation in Gaza, that sometimes the tragic humanitarian catastrophe that is also unfolding in Sudan, where some 25 million people need life-saving assistance. There are 8 million people that have been internally displaced. 1.8 million of those as refugees into equally fragile states. What are the countries that surround Sudan? Egypt, Ethiopia, South Sudan and Chad, countries that are dealing with their own humanitarian emergencies, now have the additional burden of some 1.8 million Sudanese that are fleeing the fighting between two warring factions that are not listening and adhering to a Security Council resolution demanding a Ramadan ceasefire, which, you know, was passed by the council but ignored by the parties on the ground, and two parties that simply cannot find themselves in terms of the mediation process. And then you talk about, efforts in Paris today to really close the gap in terms of the huge void we have seen in humanitarian funding. There is a current humanitarian response plan of $2.7 billion, an appeal that is only currently 6% funded. There is an additional regional refugee response plan for the crisis in Sudan to deal with refugees that are fleeing across borders. That's a request for about $1.4 billion that is currently only 7% funded. So Q efforts by the French in Paris, they are seeking to raise about $1 billion in additional humanitarian funding. We know key donors include the European Union, some 350 million euros, we understand. Germany is pledging 244 million euros, the United States $147 million, and France 110 million euros. So that will only go so far. The urgency already upon us here, that money obviously cannot come fast enough.
But most certainly very commendable effort, like you state, that the many crises in the world have seen the Sudan conflict being underreported by a number of journalists. So today, at least, it's been brought to sharp focus yet again. And here we're seeing France as well as Germany making that effort to say, let us donate the much needed funds. But after yesterday's emergency session of the Security Council, broad consensus for the need to de-escalate, not only from the SG, but member states who make up the council. This, as of course we are learning that Israel's war cabinet continues to weigh up its next step after Iran's retaliatory strike at the weekend. Any clarity on what may come next there?
So broad consensus, the Sudanese example, Mfundo, really teaches us what broad consensus necessarily means on the parties or the protagonists on the ground. Often not very much, right? You have a Security Council resolution that demanded a humanitarian pause in fighting, a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan in Sudan. And of course, that went in the one year and out the other. And I think the same can be said about this broad consensus we saw emerge around the Security Council issue table yesterday in terms of the need to de-escalate these rising tensions after the retaliatory strikes by Iran against Israel. We heard the Secretary General talk about the Middle East being on the brink. Now is the time to defuse and de-escalate. Now is the time for maximum restraint. It's vital to avoid any action that could lead to a major military escalation and confrontations on multiple fronts in the Middle East. Iran, for its part, also said that after those retaliatory strikes, it did not want to see an escalation, but it would respond forcefully if Israel were to target their interests. Israel, for its United States, before I get to Israel, the United States also said it didn't want an escalation, and that Israel's defense prowess in terms of that escalation from Iran really demonstrated its ability to respond to such attacks. The United States urging Israel to take the win. So all eyes are now on what the Israeli war cabinet is going to do. side. We got a preface from in terms of what they might decide from Israel's UN ambassador Gilad Erdan in that Security Council meeting. Let's watch what he had to say.
This attack crossed every red line, and Israel reserves the legal right to retaliate. We are not a frog in boiling water. We are a nation of lions. Following such a massive and direct attack on Israel, the entire world, let alone Israel, cannot settle for inaction. We will defend our future.
Mfundo, worth quoting again, we are not a frog in boiling water, we are a nation of lions. The words of Israel's envoy to the United Nations, I think, giving you an indication of what might eventually emerge from that war cabinet decision. Of course, Israel is not known to choreograph publicly how it might respond. This might be some clandestine operation that we might necessarily get wind of. But I can tell you that Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told his U.S. counterpart, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, that Israel had no choice but to respond. The U.S., of course, warning Israel not to rush into a retaliation that could lead to a regional conflict. So all eyes on what that cabinet decision might tell us about what happens next year. Mfundo.
But Sherwin, I must say that statement is very loaded. Thank you very much for your reportage, though. That was SABC News correspondent at the UN in New York for us.